He thought it was just another rainy night. A broken-down woman on the side of the road. A simple act of mercy. But when she looked into his eyes and whispered a name no stranger should know, everything he believed about his life began to unravel. What he discovered in the weeks that followed would expose a secret so devastating, it would force him to question everyone he trusted, including the woman who had quietly worked in his home for over a decade. It was a Thursday evening in March when Marcus Bennett, one of the wealthiest real estate developers in the country, made a decision that would change his life forever. He had just left a late meeting downtown, the kind that seals multi-million-dollar deals over whiskey and handshakes. The rain had started suddenly, the way it does in the South, turning the roads slick and the traffic into a slow crawl. Marcus rarely drove himself anymore, but that night his driver had called in sick, and he'd waved off the offer of a replacement. Sometimes, he told himself, it felt good to be alone with his thoughts. He had built an empire from nothing, survived a childhood most people wouldn't believe. And yet, despite all his success, there was a part of him that still felt hollow, like something essential had been carved out long before he could remember. He didn't talk about his past, not to investors, not to friends, not even to his wife. Some doors, once closed, were meant to stay that way. But that night, on a stretch of road he'd driven 1,000 times before, one of those doors was about to be kicked wide open. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the figure slumped beside a broken fruit cart. At first, Marcus thought it was just debris, maybe a pile of tarps. But then he saw the hand, thin and trembling, reaching toward the spilled oranges, rolling into the gutter. He slowed the car. His instinct told him to keep driving. This was a rough part of town, and stopping alone at night wasn't smart, even for someone like him. But something made him pull over. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the memory of his own mother, whoever she had been, collapsing in some forgotten place with no one to help. He stepped out into the rain, the cold water soaking through his suit jacket immediately. The woman was older, her clothes soaked and clinging to her frail body. Her face was turned away, but he could hear her labored breathing. "Ma'am," he called out, kneeling beside her. "Are you hurt? Can you hear me?" She didn't respond at first. He reached for his phone to call for help, but then her hand shot out and gripped his wrist. Her strength surprised him. Slowly, she turned her head, and for the first time, their eyes met. And that's when everything changed. Her lips parted, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said a single word. A name. Not his name. Not Marcus. But a nickname. A name only one person in the world had ever called him. A name he hadn't heard in over 30 years. His mother's name for him. "How do you know that name?" His voice came out sharper than he intended, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head slowly, her grip on his wrist loosening. "Please," she whispered, "don't let my daughter know you saw me like this." And then she fainted. Marcus stood there in the rain, his mind racing, his hands shaking. He didn't know this woman. He was sure of it. But she knew him. And not just his public identity. She knew something deeper. Something buried. He scooped her up, surprised by how light she was, and placed her gently in the back seat of his car. As he drove toward the nearest hospital, his mind kept circling back to that name. That impossible name. And one question that wouldn't let him go. Who was she? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My mom said I can't hit 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Subscribe, and let's prove her wrong. To understand why that moment shattered Marcus Bennett, you have to understand where he came from. Marcus was born in a part of the city most people only saw on the news. The kind of neighborhood where survival wasn't guaranteed, and hope was a luxury few could afford. He never knew his father. His mother, according to the official records, had died when he was 3 years old. A house fire. That's what the state told him when he was old enough to ask. No other family came forward. No one claimed him. He spent the next 15 years bouncing between foster homes, some better than others, most forgettable. But Marcus wasn't like the other kids. He didn't fight. He didn't act out. Instead, he watched. He learned. He noticed that the people who made it out weren't the loudest or the toughest. They were the ones who understood how the system worked, who could adapt, who could turn pain into fuel. By the time he aged out of the system at 18, Marcus had already started his first business, flipping furniture he found on the side of the road. Within 5 years, he owned 3 rental properties. Within 10, he was developing entire neighborhoods. By 40, he was a name people whispered, with a mix of admiration and envy. But money didn't fill the emptiness. Success didn't answer the questions that haunted him late at night. Why had his mother died? Why had no one come for him? And why did he sometimes have flashes of memories that didn't match the official story? A woman's voice singing, the smell of lavender, a hand stroking his hair. He had learned early on that digging into the past only brought pain, so he buried it, built walls around it, focused on the future. And for the most part, it worked. Until that night on the side of the road, when a dying woman spoke a name that should have been lost forever. Marcus was a man who prided himself on control. He controlled his emotions, his business, his image. But this was different. This was something he couldn't manage or explain away. And it terrified him, because deep down he had always suspected the truth about his past was darker than anyone had told him. He just didn't know how dark. Not yet. Her name was Grace. She had worked for Marcus for 12 years, longer than any other employee in his household, longer than most marriages lasted these days. She was in her early 40s, quiet and impossibly reliable. She arrived every morning at 7, prepared breakfast, cleaned, managed the household staff, and left by 6 in the evening without ever asking for anything extra. Marcus's wife, Diane, had tried for years to get Grace to open up, to join them for dinner, to accept gifts during the holidays. But Grace always declined politely. She never shared details about her life, never spoke about family or friends. The only thing anyone knew for certain was that she sent almost all her wages back home. Diane once asked where home was, and Grace had simply smiled and said, "A place where people need it more than I do." It was easy to forget she was even there. That's how good she was at her job. Invisible, efficient, perfect. But if you paid close attention, really paid attention, you might notice small things. The way she flinched whenever Marcus raised his voice, even if it wasn't directed at her. The way she avoided looking at family photos. The way her hands trembled slightly whenever Diane mentioned Marcus's childhood. Marcus had noticed these things over the years, But he'd never asked. People had their reasons for being private, and he respected that. Besides, Grace was the best employee he'd ever had. She never gossiped, never overstepped, never caused problems. But there was one moment, about 3 years ago, that stuck with him. It was late one evening, and Marcus had come home early from a business trip. He found Grace in the hallway, staring at an old photo of him from college. She didn't hear him approach, and when he cleared his throat, she jumped so violently she nearly dropped the frame. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Bennett," she'd stammered, her face flushed. "I was just dusting." He'd waved it off, but the look in her eyes stayed with him. It wasn't embarrassment. It was something else, something that looked almost like grief. At the time, he'd dismissed it. But now, sitting in the hospital waiting room, while doctors examined the woman he'd pulled from the roadside, that memory came rushing back. And with it, a question he'd never thought to ask. Why had Grace looked at him like that? Like she knew him, in a way no employee should. The doctor came out just after midnight. The woman was stable, but severely dehydrated and malnourished. She'd been living on the streets for weeks, maybe longer. She had no identification on her, no phone, no wallet. Just a small cloth bag with a few belongings and a photograph. "We found this in her pocket," the doctor said, handing Marcus a faded picture. It was old, the edges worn and discolored, but the image was clear enough. 2 women standing in front of a modest house, arms around each other, smiling. One of them was younger, maybe in her 20s. The other was older, her face kind but tired. Marcus stared at the photo, his chest tightening. He didn't recognize either of them, but there was something about the way they stood, the way they looked at the camera, that felt familiar, like a memory just out of reach. "Can I see her?" he asked. The doctor hesitated. "She's sedated right now." But she did say something before she went under. She kept repeating a name. "Grace." Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him. He called Grace from the parking lot, his hands still shaking. She answered on the first ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. "Mr. Bennett? Is everything all right? I need you to come to General Hospital. Now." There was a pause, a long one. "Is someone hurt? Just come, please." When Grace arrived 20 minutes later, Marcus was waiting by the entrance. She looked exactly as she always did. Calm, composed. But her eyes told a different story. "Mr. Bennett, what's going on?" He didn't answer. Instead, he led her through the sterile hallways to the woman's room. The moment Grace saw her through the glass window, she froze. Her hand flew to her mouth, and a sound escaped her throat that Marcus had never heard before. A broken, guttural sob. "You know her?" he said. It wasn't a question. Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. "That's my mother." They sat in a small waiting room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Grace had her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Marcus sat across from her, his mind racing. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was low, controlled, but the anger was there, simmering beneath the surface. Grace looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "Because she made me promise. She made me swear I would never tell you who she was or what she knew." "What she knew?" Marcus leaned forward. "What the hell does that mean, Grace?" Grace shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks again. I can't do this to her. She's been through enough." Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Your mother recognized me. She called me by a name no one should know. A name my mother used. So you're going to sit here and explain to me how that's possible? Or I swear to God, She knew your mother." The words came out in a rush, desperate and raw. "My mother knew your mother. They were best friends. They grew up together." The room went silent except for the hum of the lights. Marcus stared at her, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "That's impossible. My mother died in a fire. There were no friends, no family, no one." Grace wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. "That's what they wanted you to believe. But it's not the truth. Your mother didn't die in that fire, Mr. Bennett. She was taken from you." Marcus felt the walls closing in. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. "Taken? What do you mean, taken?" Grace looked at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Pity. Deep, aching pity. "She was alive for years after that fire. And my mother is the only person who knows what really happened to her." Hit that subscribe button. Let's prove my mom wrong today. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. He sat in his office at home, staring at the photograph the doctor had given him, his mind spinning in 1,000 directions at once. Grace had refused to say more. She'd begged him to wait until her mother was strong enough to tell the story herself. But Marcus wasn't a patient man. By sunrise, he'd made 12 calls. Private investigators, lawyers, people who specialized in finding things that didn't want to be found. Within 48 hours, he had a team assembled. Their mission was simple: find out everything about his mother's death and everything that happened before and after. No stone left unturned. No question left unanswered. The first report came back within a week, and it was already full of inconsistencies. The fire that supposedly killed his mother had been ruled accidental at the time. Faulty wiring, but there were no electrical inspections on file, no autopsy report, no death certificate that matched the official story. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to make sure the details stayed vague. The second report was even more disturbing. His mother's name, the one on his original birth certificate, had been changed twice in the public records, once shortly after the fire, and again 6 months later. Someone had been covering tracks, and they'd been thorough. Marcus began to notice other things too, small things that didn't add up. The way certain people in his industry, older men who'd known him for years, would sometimes look at him with an expression he couldn't quite place. Recognition? Fear? He'd always assumed it was respect or envy. But now he wasn't so sure. And then there was Grace. She came to work every day as if nothing had happened. But Marcus could see the cracks forming. She avoided his eyes, jumped at sudden noises. Twice he caught her standing outside his office door, her hand raised to knock, only to turn and walk away. She was terrified, and that terrified him. One evening, about 10 days after the hospital incident, Marcus found Grace in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The house was empty. Diane had taken the kids to visit her parents for the weekend. It was just the two of them. "Grace," he said quietly. She turned, her expression guarded. "Yes, Mr. Bennett. I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Whatever your mother is protecting me from, whatever secret you've been carrying, I need to know now." Grace set down the knife she'd been holding, her hands shaking. "You don't understand what you're asking." "Then help me understand." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Resignation. Or maybe relief. "My mother didn't just know your mother, Mr. Bennett. She helped hide you. She's the reason you're alive." Grace told him to sit down. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. Her mother's name was Ruth. She had grown up in the same neighborhood as Marcus's mother, a woman named Evelyn. They'd been inseparable as children, more like sisters than friends. They'd dreamed of leaving their small town, of building better lives somewhere far away. But life had other plans. Evelyn got pregnant at 19. The father was a man named David Holt, a local business owner from a wealthy family. At first, he'd promised to marry her. But when his family found out, they made it clear that wasn't going to happen. A poor black girl with no family and no prospects? Unacceptable. David's father offered Evelyn money to disappear. A lot of money, enough to start over somewhere else. But Evelyn refused. She wanted her son to know his father. She wanted David to do the right thing. And that's when things turned ugly. Grace paused, her eyes distant, as if she were seeing something far away. "My mother said they came in the middle of the night. 3 men. They set the house on fire, while Evelyn and you were inside." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. "But she got out," Grace continued. "She managed to get you out first, handed you to my mother, who was waiting outside. But when she went back for her things, the men grabbed her. They told her if she ever came back, if she ever tried to contact you, they'd finish what they started, and they'd make sure you went down with her." "So she just left?" Marcus's voice was raw, broken. "She just abandoned me." Grace shook her head, tears streaming down her face again. "She didn't abandon you. She saved you. My mother took you to a shelter the next town over. She told them she'd found you wandering alone. She made sure you were placed somewhere safe. And then she spent the next 30 years watching over you from a distance, making sure you were okay." "And you?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "How do you fit into this?" Grace looked down at her hands. "When I was old enough, my mother told me the truth. She told me about Evelyn, about you, and she asked me to do something for her." "What?" "To find you, to make sure you were safe, to be there if you ever needed help." Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "So this whole time, you working for me, it was never just a job?" "No," Grace whispered. "It was a promise." Over the next few weeks, the investigation uncovered more. David Holt was still alive, living in a gated estate on the other side of the city. He was in his 70s now, retired, but still connected, still powerful. His family's company had grown into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. And Marcus's real estate empire? It had, by pure coincidence or perhaps fate, been built in direct competition with Holt's developments for the last decade. They'd been rivals without Marcus ever knowing they were something more, father and son. The investigators also found records of payments made to various officials over the years, bribes to keep certain documents sealed, payoffs to ensure certain questions were never asked. It was a web of corruption and cover-up that stretched back decades. But the most devastating discovery came when the team finally tracked down Evelyn. She was alive, barely, living in a care facility 3 states away under a different name. She had been there for over 20 years, diagnosed with severe trauma-induced amnesia. She didn't remember her name, didn't remember her past, didn't remember Marcus, but Ruth remembered. And when Marcus finally sat down with her in the hospital, after she'd recovered enough to speak, she told him everything. Ruth's voice was weak but steady as she recounted the night of the fire. I was supposed to meet Evelyn at her place that evening. We were going to celebrate your 3rd birthday the next day. But when I got there, the house was already burning. I heard you crying, and I saw her stumble out with you in her arms. She handed you to me, told me to run, and then she went back inside. I didn't understand why until I saw the men. They grabbed her right there on the street, threw her into a car. She was screaming your name, screaming for me to take care of you, and then they were gone. Marcus sat in silence, his hands clenched into fists. Why didn't you go to the police? Ruth's eyes filled with tears. I tried, but the police were paid off. David's family owned half the town. I was nobody, a single mother with no money and no power. If I'd pushed too hard, they would have come after me too. And then who would have protected you? So you just watched, Marcus said, his voice hollow. You just watched me grow up alone. I never stopped watching, Ruth said fiercely. I made sure you were placed in good homes. I checked on you every few months. And when you aged out of the system, I sent Grace to find you. Why? Marcus looked at her, his eyes red. Why go through all that trouble? Why not just tell me the truth? Ruth reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Because your mother's last words to me were, keep him safe. And that's exactly what I did. Marcus spent the next few days in a fog. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Diane tried to reach him, but he couldn't find the words to explain what he'd learned. How do you tell someone that your entire life has been built on a lie? That the person you thought you were never really existed? But beneath the grief and the anger, something else was growing. A need for answers. A need for justice. He called his lawyers and told them to prepare for war. He was going after David Holt. Not just in court. Everywhere. He wanted the world to know what had been done to his mother. What had been done to him. But first, he needed to see her. He needed to see Evelyn. The care facility was a quiet place, surrounded by trees and gardens. It looked peaceful. But Marcus felt nothing but dread as he walked through the doors. The staff led him to a small room where an older woman sat by the window, staring out at the garden. She was thin, her hair gray and wispy. But there was something about her profile, something about the curve of her jaw, that made his breath catch. Evelyn, he said softly. She didn't respond. He stepped closer, his heart pounding. Mom? Still nothing. The nurse who'd accompanied him spoke gently. She doesn't respond to names or voices. The trauma she experienced caused significant damage. She's been like this for years. Marcus knelt beside her chair, his eyes searching her face for any sign of recognition. I don't know if you can hear me, he said, his voice breaking. But I'm your son. I'm Marcus, and I just want you to know that I'm okay. I made it. I survived. And I'm going to make sure the people who did this to you pay for what they did. For a moment, there was nothing. And then slowly, Evelyn turned her head. Her eyes met his. And for just a fraction of a second, something flickered there. Something that looked almost like recognition. A single tear rolled down her cheek. And then she turned back to the window, lost once again in whatever world her mind had created to protect her. Marcus sat there for a long time, holding her hand, crying quietly. When he finally stood to leave, he made a promise. I'm going to fix this, he whispered. I'm going to make sure your name is cleared. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you sacrificed for me. It took 3 more weeks before the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Marcus's legal team had been relentless, digging through records, interviewing witnesses, building a case. But it was Grace who uncovered the truth that changed everything. She came to Marcus's office one evening, her face pale, holding a folder. "There's something you need to see," she said quietly. Inside the folder was a birth certificate. Not his, another one. A girl born 2 years after him. Same mother, same father. Marcus stared at the document, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "What is this?" Grace took a deep breath. "When my mother helped your mother escape that night, your mother was pregnant again. David didn't know. No one knew except my mother. She helped Evelyn hide for a few months, long enough to have the baby. But Evelyn was in no condition to take care of another child. She was traumatized, scared, barely able to take care of herself. So, my mother did the only thing she could think of." Marcus looked up at her, realization dawning slowly. "No." Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. "My mother adopted her, raised her as her own. That baby was me." The room spun. Marcus gripped the edge of his desk, his knees threatening to buckle. "You're my sister." "Half-sister," Grace whispered. "I've known for 10 years. My mother told me when I turned 30. She thought I deserved to know the truth. But she made me swear I'd never tell you unless it was absolutely necessary. She said you'd already lost so much. She didn't want to take away the life you'd built." Marcus couldn't breathe. All these years, Grace had been there, watching over him, protecting him, not just because of a promise, but because they were family. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Because I was afraid," Grace said simply. "Afraid you'd hate me for keeping it from you. Afraid it would destroy the life you'd worked so hard to build. Afraid that knowing the truth would hurt more than not knowing." Marcus crossed the room and pulled her into a fierce hug. For the first time in weeks, he felt something other than anger and grief. He felt connection, family, something he'd been searching for his entire life without even knowing it. "I could never hate you," he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "You're my sister." The lawsuit against David Holt and his family made national headlines. Marcus didn't hold back. He released every piece of evidence his team had uncovered. The bribes, the cover-ups, the violence. The media descended on the story like vultures, and within weeks, David Holt's empire began to crumble. His company lost investors. His reputation was destroyed. Several members of his family were charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy. David himself, now frail and facing the end of his life, issued a public statement denying everything. But the evidence was overwhelming. The court ruled in Marcus's favor, awarding him a symbolic $1 in damages. He didn't want their money. He wanted their legacy destroyed. And he got it. But more than that, Marcus used his platform to shine a light on the countless other women and children who'd been victimized by powerful men over the years. He established a foundation in his mother's name, dedicated to helping survivors of domestic violence and families torn apart by corruption. Ruth, despite her age and frailty, became the face of the foundation, telling her story to anyone who would listen. And Grace? She stepped down from her position as housekeeper and took on a new role as Marcus's business partner. Together, they expanded the foundation's reach, opening shelters, funding legal aid programs, and advocating for policy changes. Marcus also made arrangements for his mother, Evelyn, to receive the best care available. Though she never fully regained her memory, there were moments, brief and fleeting, where she seemed to recognize him. Those moments became the most precious things in his life. Diane stood by him through it all, though the revelations had shaken their marriage. It took time and a lot of therapy, but they found their way back to each other. And their children, once they were old enough to understand, were told the truth about their family's history. Not the sanitized version, the real one. Because Marcus had learned the hard way that secrets only ever caused pain. The truth, no matter how ugly, was always better than a lie. 1 year after that rainy night, on the side of the road, Marcus held a private ceremony at the care facility where his mother lived. Grace was there, Ruth was there, though she was too weak to stand. Even Diane and the kids came. They planted a tree in Evelyn's honor right outside her window. And as they stood there in the fading light, Marcus finally felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness. Not yet. But peace. The kind that comes from knowing the truth. From knowing you're not alone. Looking back now, Marcus often thought about that night. About the choice he made to stop and help a stranger. If he'd driven past, if he'd ignored his instinct, he never would have known the truth. He would have lived the rest of his life believing he was alone in the world. And maybe that would have been easier. But it wouldn't have been real. The truth had cost him his sense of identity. It had forced him to confront painful realities about his past and the people who'd shaped it. But it had also given him something invaluable: family, connection, purpose. Grace once asked him if he regretted learning the truth. He thought about it for a long time before answering. No, he said finally, because the truth, no matter how hard, is the only thing that sets you free. And I'd rather live with a painful truth than a comfortable lie. Ruth passed away quietly in her sleep 2 years later. She died knowing that she'd kept her promise, that Marcus was safe, that he knew he was loved, that he understood the sacrifices that had been made for him. At her funeral, Marcus spoke about the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, about how his life had been saved not by wealth or power, but by the quiet courage of a woman who refused to turn away when others did. He talked about how we often overlook the people who hold our lives together, the ones who work in the background, the ones who sacrifice without recognition, the ones who carry secrets to protect us. And he challenged everyone listening to ask themselves a question. Who in your life has been watching over you without you even knowing? Who has made sacrifices you've never acknowledged? Who has carried your burdens in silence? Because the truth is, we're all connected in ways we don't always see. We're all part of each other's stories. And sometimes, the greatest acts of love are the ones that go unnoticed for decades. Marcus ended his speech with a simple statement. My mother saved me twice, once from a fire, and once from a life lived in lies. And I will spend the rest of my life honoring both of those gifts. As the ceremony ended and people filed out, Marcus stood beside his mother's tree, Grace at his side. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They understood now what Ruth had always known. That family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who show up, the people who stay, the people who protect you even when you don't know you need protecting. And that love, real love, isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's hidden. Sometimes it waits 30 years to be seen. But it's always there, and it's always worth finding. So, let me ask you something. If you found out tomorrow that everything you believed about your life was wrong, would you want to know the truth? If you discovered that someone you barely noticed had been protecting you all along, how would that change the way you see the world? And if you were given the choice between a comfortable lie and a painful truth, which would you choose? Think about it. Because the people in this story aren't that different from the people in your life. The sacrifices, the secrets, the silent acts of love, they're happening all around us, every day. We just have to be willing to see them. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think differently about the people in your life, let us know in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you've ever uncovered a truth that changed everything. And if you believe kindness still matters, if you believe every life is worth protecting, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the truth. Even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. My mom said I can't hit 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Subscribe, and let's prove her wrong. And remember, the next time you pass someone on the side of the road, the next time you overlook someone working quietly in the background, ask yourself, what story are they carrying? What sacrifice have they made that you'll never see? You might be surprised by the answer.